A classroom for anthropomorphized plants, cactus slackers, seaweed theatre kids, and of course, petunia preps. Teachers' plants instead of teachers' pets. And the teacher, yeah, he's a big tree, who gives the students apples so that they can get to know him. That's it. That's the poem.
That's really lovely. It reminds me of a bunch of different children's books that I've read.
Yeah, that's what I was going for, trying to capture that image of like Timothy Goes to School, the cartoons about, oh, there's the rabbits and there's the raccoons and there's the turtles and they're all going to school together, but instead of animals, it's plants. I know I just described exactly what the poem says. Yeah, that's what's been on my mind.
It's a good image, and I think it lends well to this conversation about education for the third week in this series.
Yep.
And today we're answering a lot of big questions, in my opinion, and I'm hoping we'll get through them. So to start, we wanted to talk about food, which is something we all know. We've all eaten food. And how its relationship with education has been morphed over time in a negative way, and perhaps how it can be positively used to help better children's education.
You sound so practiced and professional.
Thank you.
So brain foods. Because that's something that every time when I was growing up, whenever we'd have fish, I always remember, and it stuck with me. My parents would always say, you have to eat it. It's brain food. And let me tell you, I didn't need much encouragement to finish my plate. But I always wondered if it was actually true, and it is true. So I know that you took this question into more of a logistical, practical, procedural method by thinking about how schools can offer lunches and things like that.
Yeah, I did.
I just wanted to know whether beets and fish and nuts were really good for your brain, or whether that was a bit of an exaggeration, because I know a lot of the quote-unquote superfood genre can be overblown.
For sure. I feel like partially even with the superfoods, it's a bit of a placebo. I remember before exams or before like a track meet, my mom would always give us specific types of food. She was like, you have to eat your carbs, carbo load, which is a thing. But same with exams. She'd give us a bunch of fruit and stuff before to try and get us, our brains lubricated for the quest ahead.
Well, yeah, I don't remember where I was reading it, but there was a story online about someone whose dad had always told him that you need to down a can of Coke or something like that before each exam. That's our family kind of lucky charm, and you always do well with it. And the kid always found that it was the case for him, and then he was just diagnosed with really low blood sugar or something like that. Well, I don't know if there's a moral to that fable, but anyway, brain foods. So yeah, it started with like walnuts and the omega-3 foods like fish and avocados. You know, you always hear about those being good for your brain, and it's true. And I was also questioning what it means when food is good for your brain. How do you think it's usually determined?
That is incredibly challenging for me to answer. I feel like in my head it would be, it helps boost concentration. So probably fats, because I feel like they break down slower than sugars. So that's why the avocados and the fish and things are good for you, but not like modified fats, natural ones. Is that remotely on track?
I just meant, how do you think that they usually quantify it? Because when I hear like, oh, this is good for your brain, this makes me sound so dumb, but I know I do that on the podcast all the time. I always have the image of like scientists giving the person food after having them take an IQ test, and they have to take it afterwards or something like that, or like memorize something. But most often what I find is being referenced is this food really reduces the risk of Alzheimer's and cognitive degeneration as you age and things like that. And I suppose they kind of extrapolate that and say, well, if it's good at preventing this, it's probably, that's just a sign of overall health. And yeah, the omega-3 foods, those are really good for that, as well as just your general learning and memory, as you said. And berries, especially blueberries, those are big anti-inflammatory and antioxidants. They can help the communication between your brain cells, which just sounds good. And I was also interested in the story about, I don't know if you've heard this, but in evolution, they always say the reason we have such big brains is because of what we used to eat, what our ancestors decided to eat, helped us fuel the brain growth generationally. And that's kind of the current theory, is that it's not even the fact that we were eating a lot of meat, it's the fact that even before we were hunting meat, we were breaking into carcasses and eating bone marrow.
Oh, wow.
And salt played a role in there as well. So because
That's
you
not
don't see a lot of
information I needed.
you don't see a lot of other primates like salting their food.
That's very true. Seasoning.
Seasoning, exactly.
Seasoning is why we are the way we are.
Yeah.
I'll take that into account every time I salt my food.
And I don't know if it carries on today, but if it does, yeah, bone marrow. Another food is turmeric. I think you know that. This is kind of like a superfood, isn't it? Like,
yeah, it's an anti-inflammatory.
It gets mentioned all over the place. Its active ingredient is called curcumin, and it helps new brain cells grow. It boosts serotonin, and it can benefit memory.
Yeah, I am putting together this thing for Solacene. You don't know this yet, but okay. I'm putting together a guide to boosting memory and getting off the internet. It's very much in the prototype stage, but turmeric and cocoa were both listed as things that boost memory.
Yeah, I did see that. Dark chocolate.
Yeah.
Even like dark chocolate does have short-term, there is data to prove that it will just help you do better for a test and things like that.
Because it boosts serotonin, which is crucial to your brain doing a lot of other things, not just being happy.
Beets.
Beets. You're a big beet guy.
Yeah, and I know that this angers you because you probably always want beets to be like bad for you or something because you don't like the things that I champion and the things that I make you eat, but they contain a lot of nitrates, and these can promote the dilation of blood vessels, which generally just increases blood flow to the brain.
Wow.
Which is a really good thing. And the podcast I was listening to also said, and they'll also stain the heck out of a wooden chopping board.
Oh, yeah, they will.
I can attest to that. Stain the heck out of your fingers as well. And certain mushrooms also really good for you. And when I was thinking about food, I was like, well, it's not just the types of foods, okay? Because all the articles and podcasts and videos I could find on the subject were mainly assessing the diets and routines of confessed geniuses across time. So like mathematical geniuses, I don't know, political thinkers, just celebrities, artists who often lean towards more eccentric diets. And the podcasts and the videos were kind of making the point that, see, this person just drank alcohol and ate leaves, and and they produced the Sistine Chapel. But one, I feel like that's a fallacy, that line of thinking. And another thing that I found really interesting, even amongst the most eccentric examples, which are of course what kind of makes the news and what people know of, is that even whatever they were eating, it tended to be quite regular. They tended to have quite a routine, and possibly even take it to absurd extremes. Like there's a story about David Lynch, who every day for I think 7 or 8 years just went to the same cafe and had the same drink and the same like baked good. And Steve Jobs was famous for being rather militant about always following like certain diets, and he'd do that for a week or a month and stick to it very closely. And Nikola Tesla, there's some stories about him always dining at the same times and things like that. So I do think that whatever you're eating, and I don't really want to be like promoting too many dietary habits on the podcast because that's not really our bag, but I do think routine is a good habit universally.
I agree. I didn't think about that too much when thinking about brain foods and routine and such. But even you have to think about those eccentric examples who it's like they drank just wine and a cigarette every day or whatever, and they produced these famous paintings. It was more than anything probably the lifestyle of low stress and low inflammation, I suppose, that we have from our diets and even how we eat. And speaking of how we eat, how did you like your lunchtimes in school?
My school lunches?
Yeah.
They were often very lonely.
Yes.
And it was often just me and my lunchbox, which contained, for roughly 12 years, a juice box, a yogurt tube, a sandwich or two, and a fruit or a granola bar.
That was the standard across everyone I've ever met.
Yes.
That's what they had for lunch, essentially. Sometimes the sandwich would be subbed out for something else, but that was the general structure. Always the juice box. Then you had your water bottle as well, which you would sometimes be lucky enough to have a fountain at your school that you could fill up.
Yes, yes.
I remember there was this period of time where you just couldn't drink the water at our school for a couple of years. So like what you brought in the morning was what you got. So if you were thirsty, too bad. And I know it's very different even across North America, the degree to which students eat at their school cafeterias or they take their lunches or they go home for lunch. But overall, the average amount of time for a lunch in North America is 40 to 60 minutes. However, they often stagger the times that the children are in the cafeterias eating because the cafeterias are a limited size, so they can't fit the whole school in at once. So it's usually 15 to 20-minute chunks you have to eat. That includes getting to the cafeteria, washing your hands, if you're doing that, getting your lunch out, eating it, and so on. And I remember, in elementary school in particular, there was one microwave that the whole school used, and in those 15 minutes, oftentimes you'd just be stuck in the lineup with a cold lunch that you'd have to start eating because you had like 2 minutes left. And a lot of other examples like that, but overall it promotes this really negative relationship to food, which we talked about on the What's Wrong episode. But not just the negative relationship to food, the fact that you then have like 2 or 3 hours of classes after that that you're supposed to be alert for. So even if you get to eat a nice lunch in those 15 minutes, it's not going to have digested in the time that you then have outside or doing whatever. And if you forget a lunch, a lot of times in Canada, from my experience, I know it's a little different in the States, like there isn't an alternative. Like you just have to kind of go hungry if you forget it and don't have any money to pay at the cafeteria.
Those were dark days.
Yeah, and if you had scrounged some money from your friends, you were like, hey guys, I forgot my lunch. Do you all have some money? And they'd say, yeah. You pool your money, you go to the cafeteria to get something. Your options are pizza, baked chips, juice.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'd have fruit, but usually it'd be quite moldy. Just kind of...
Not healthy is what you're saying.
Not healthy. Yeah.
I remember, this is slightly of an aside, but when we were in university and we had a meal hall which offered a great variety of foods every day, which was very fortunate, but there was the one station which was, as you described, more pizza-y, junky French fries. And I don't know if it was my high school brain or what, but I was convinced that hot dogs, there's something about them that are actually, they don't deserve to be lumped in with the rest of those foods. They're good for you.
You did have that era.
And I actually did look into it for today's episode. And
why?
Because I still have a feeling, because sausages are so cultural and historical and they can't be so awful for you. Like hot dogs, they're not that far from sausage shape-wise. And they're kind of colored like brains when you think about it. And they feel almost like eating a brain in a tube.
I hope there's no vegetarians listening to this.
Yeah.
They're not going to like
But no, they're not.
The conversation.
They're not good for you.
No, of course they're not good for you. They're like the opposite to me. They're like the anti-aesthetic of health. They're just one color of pink. Like,
yeah, well,
no, there's no way.
They took them off the factory floor or whatever it is, but yeah.
Okay, I'm glad that you have proven once and for all that they are not healthy. I'm sure sausages are perhaps a step above, but not hot dogs. And getting back to the question, which is what should the relationship to food be in schools? I think it should be a longer lunch break, and it should just be a priority. It should be treated like a class, as it is in some parts of the world, where, okay, we're going to give the students an hour to 2 hours. Treat it like a class. You're going to have 45 minutes to eat, and we don't expect you just to like scarf down your food so you can get outside faster. We expect you to wash your hands, share the food with your friends, and the school, I think it should be top priority that the school provides high quality food for students, because there's countless studies on the benefits of healthy food to students' performance, and it's a 1-to-1 ratio pretty much of students in higher economic classes who perform better due to their diets versus lower economic classes. Obviously, there's a number of other reasons, but diet is the number one thing impacting students' performance because it impacts concentration, behavior. Like, for example, in classes where students eat like really junk foody lunches, after lunch it's just chaos. The teacher can't control them. And it's been disproven the link between sugar and hyperactivity, but it still promotes bad behavior. Bad foods do.
Sugar?
Not just sugar.
Well, it's still going to give you the crash.
Yeah, the unbalanced diet, nature of the diet. And I thought I'd bring forward my favorite case study of school lunches in France.
Okay.
In France, essentially, there is a nationwide program that says you need to provide lunches in schools, and there's different mandates that go on. Okay, now you have to have 1 vegetarian meal a week and so on. But they're not funded entirely by the federal government. They're funded by the municipalities, which is crazy to me. Imagine the mayor of your town getting together with your school chef every single week or every single month to plan out the diet for that month. That was crazy because I'm like, why would the mayor be concerned with what the kids are eating? Why wouldn't she?
No, it sounds ideal. It reminds me a little bit in America where a lot of schools are funded, or at least partially funded, by property taxes. But what it does mean is that there's an inequality because the rich neighborhoods are going to have more money for their schools.
Exactly.
Which is not a good thing.
No, it's not a good thing.
But I understand that local government should definitely play a bigger part in it. Hogwarts comes to mind. And it strikes me also that we've been a little bit too compromising, I think, so far in this episode and also in the previous episodes in the education series. I don't know what it is about the education discussion that perhaps we're just really, really not used to trying to be idealists with it. But it's like it shouldn't be a question of whether schools will provide lunches in the Solacene. Of course they will. Like this is the ideal world. This is utopia. Yeah, they can.
Yeah, and learning about the lunches in France was like thinking about kids who went to Hogwarts because there are always 3 to 4 courses, it seems, including an entree, an appetizer or a side dish, a dessert, and a cheese course, which I thought you'd be interested in because you like dairy.
I do, but you're the cheese fiend.
I do love cheese, but you're the one who let me get back into dairy. Not let me, enticed me, because I was always like pretty anti-dairy, but then you're like, no, it seems good for you. And I feel like the fact that they have a whole cheese course in French schools is really inspiring to me.
Okay.
And looking into the school system in France, lunch-wise, I also started looking into its education system as a whole and a bunch of other school systems across the world and like what age they started at, what age they end at. And France specifically had a really unique start age, which is now being pushed lower to 2 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
2 years old.
I had never heard of that. And it's not necessarily they're going into grade primary or kindergarten at age 2, but it is a type of kindergarten in which is really focused on teaching children language because there's a lot of immigrants to France and people who speak a lot of different languages anyway. So in those families where they speak a different language in the home, the kids, if they entered school at age 6, only ever hearing a different language than French, they're going to be slightly out of luck. So the thinking behind starting them at age 2 is to learn the language.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense in a globalized world.
I agree. What do you feel like the ideal start age is for a kid?
Yeah, I was looking into it around the countries, and it doesn't seem like there's, I mean, France sounds like a mild outlier there with 2 years old. It doesn't sound like there's that much variation. You're either 4, 5, or 6. And I was like, I don't really think it matters that much. I think it would be a lot dependent on the kid. It's probably quite obvious to the parents and those around them if they're ready for school or not. You know, there's probably some 5-year-olds who are lagging. Maybe they should go an extra year and vice versa. What do you think?
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
I was thinking in the Solacene we'll have an option. I feel like the starting at age 2 is an interesting option to have if parents perhaps just don't have the capacity to prepare the kid from that young, whereas other families perhaps they do just want to have their kids at home, teach them the basics themselves. I think having the option, and then 6 as the definite 100% of these 6-year-olds need to be enrolled in school or in some kind of education.
Yeah.
But I think the option is a good idea for the Solacene.
One thing I've always found hilarious is that within a grade, there will be kids who are practically a year apart anyway, which I know there's no way around with the current way that we do grades, which is the cutoff is September 12th or whatever it is. But then if there's a kid born on September 13th, then they are
a year older than the
pretty
kids
much a
born.
year older
Yeah.
than the kids at the end of the year.
And that leads to, I feel like, a lot of really weird dynamics because those kids are just always going to be way bigger. Like, there's going to be stuff like that
they're always
going
bigger
on.
and cooler. I'm sure, I mean, I didn't look up to it, but I'm sure there's data that the more popular kids, and, you know, because they're, like, faster. And
they can drive first.
That's true, yeah.
And so I think either not having the kids in these silos of these 1-year groups, perhaps bigger age ranges in general.
We were both kind of like the runts of our grade. You more so, right? With the summer birthday.
Yeah, it was very small.
But I was always, slightly smaller as well. I mean, obviously it evens out as you age, but at the start, it can be quite dramatic, I think, within the class, which is
100%.
Which is just funny.
It is kind of funny.
I think there's a little bit more of a meaningful debate to be had about, or conversation to be had about when kids finish school. And again, it's like amongst the developed countries, I didn't find that much variation between 16, 17, or 18. And I was trying to think about it as in how it felt the last couple of years in high school, because we finished when we were 18. We went to school in Nova Scotia, and that's what pretty much all of North America does. And when I'm actually trying to reappraise it, I do think that it could end a year earlier. I do think that 17, maybe 16 is a little bit too young, but 17 I think is, because effectively you're just trying to determine what's the age when they become mature enough to be in society and the workplace and everything. And I think 17, because for the most part, the last year of high school is just everyone bragging about how they have better things to do anyway, or at least that's how it was in my class. Everyone was just talking about their jobs they had, or desperate to get to college, etc.
Yeah, and then there were the group of kids doing the uni prep courses anyway, if you were doing AP or IB or whatever version of that you have. And so I feel like, to me, my answer to this question was stopping high school as we knew it.
Yep.
Those basic mandatory curriculums at age 15.
Wow.
And then having 16 to 18 options. So it varies across the world. Like in Quebec, they have a 1-year option that you can do after you finish. And it's called cégep. Or in France, it's a 3-year thing called lycée. Or in more northern countries, I think it's, or even across Europe, it's called gymnasium.
This is an intermediary between high school and university?
Yeah, but it's to varying degrees across the world mandatory. So in the Solacene, I imagine kids stopping 15, but that's not the end of their education officially. Like they have to do the gymnasium or the last few years of university prep, or there could be different options. You could do vocational, you could do an apprenticeship. But I feel like at 15, kids know what they want to be for the most part. My sister was 15 a year or two ago, and she always knew what she wanted to be at that point. And I feel like those last 2 years in high school, when you're a 15-year-old in Canada, 3 years after you're 15, your spirit for life almost just dwindles.
Yeah, I agree with that part, but I do disagree with the fact that with the idea that most 15-year-olds know what they want to be.
Well, that's why they're not going right into university. They're going to go into a more general preparatory experience, but they have a choice. I feel like at 15 they have an idea.
So it might actually be helping them to not make the wrong mistake when it comes to choosing a degree.
Because it's free.
Oh, it's free, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I do like that idea, yeah. I don't know if 15. I think maybe 16.
Maybe
16 and have it be a 2-year program, because in grade 10, which is when you're 15, you're still learning a lot of stuff.
That's true.
I would say we get rid of grade 11 and 12 and have it be this kind of transitional thing.
I like that.
À la cégep in Quebec.
You have to wonder where the grading system came from in the first place, don't you? Why are we in school for a mandatory 13 years? And then now an almost mandatory 2 or 4 years on top of that, because I feel like it's always said a bachelor's degree is basically the new high school degree, and that even people working in jobs that don't require one have a bachelor's degree.
Yeah, and even if you're not getting a bachelor's, if you want, as you said, a trades license, it's usually going to take at least 2 years. Whereas perhaps in the past, there were more high school graduates coming out with, or more routes. There was, you could do an apprenticeship, you could go straight into the workplace, things like that.
I feel like apprenticeships need to come back. I know that they exist all over the world. Like lots of people I know have done internships, but I feel like apprenticeship is different. You're going to spend a year under this person's wing, and it's more like that one-on-one teacher model, but there's enough people around.
No, there's enough people around for sure, but it's I think that's a reflection of the way economics has changed, to the point that your local builders, just work for a giant building firm, or the same with your local chefs. They don't really, it's not their restaurant. They can't do that. I was reading about how architects in like the Middle Ages, who were they were the builders. So the architects and the builders, the people putting the bricks on the ground actually knew more about construction than the people today who put the bricks on the ground in a lot of cases, because they were also involved in getting the materials and things like that. So that full-bodied understanding of your job, like if you're a baker back in the day, you knew everything about baking. Whereas a lot of bakers today, if you, like, let's say the baker who just works at the local supermarket, most often isn't baking the thing from scratch. Again, that sounds like I'm criticizing them. I'm not, though.
No.
I just think that was a different time in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I feel like today we either go the two extremes. It's either you try and do everything yourself and you're kind of bad at it all, or you are just doing like a really specific task. There's no balance of like community and individualism. It's just either you're fully individual or you're fully just a part of, I don't even know if you can call it community at that point when you're just...
Yeah, you're just a cog, basically.
Cog, yeah.
Are we in the part of the episode where we're talking about, to quote you from the last episode, negative grubby holdovers?
Yeah, we are.
So my first one that I wanted to bring up was a gripe that you and I shared for many years, or for the last 4 years or so, was the random required courses that we had to take in university for our degree. And I'll quote myself over many, many rants, and you have to pay for them. Because I always said that, because that was one of the things that annoys you most when you're having to take out loans for your degree and things, and you're having to take out loans for classes you don't want to take.
Yes.
And that you don't want to learn about.
Yeah, and there's no option to just write a test to skip them.
Yeah. So this is called in the US general education, or gen ed. And it basically there, with ours, it was kind of sprinkled through our degree. Although I think mostly clustered in the first year or the second year. But there it is like almost a mini program that they have to take at the start of their diploma. And it's often a third to a half of a degree, which I thought was an incredible amount.
That's insane.
So it was kind of instated in the 1800s to standardize student knowledge, because I guess high schools and elementary schools were so much less standardized that kids coming to universities from different places knew wildly different things. So this is like, we need a baseline in how you can write, talk, do some math, know some basic trivia stuff.
Yeah, that's still purported as the reasoning behind it. They say, well, we need to catch everyone up. Because I remember first year biology and chemistry, we just kept saying, this is what we did in high school. Why do we have to do it again? And they said, well, we want everyone to have a baseline before you go into your second year. Which is obviously, we want everyone to have the opportunity to learn these things. But the standardization or the baseline should just come before university. Or be an option.
Yeah. Or like a summer, we offer these things over the summer to prepare you for the school. I agree. So that so much of your courses aren't learning how to write an essay. Or in your case, learning how to use Microsoft Word.
Yeah, that was my least favorite course, but...
I understand the motive behind it, which is we want to ensure a kind of breadth of education as well as just a depth in one particular subject. I'm just saying I don't think it was very effective. I think it's like this extension of the school's bureaucracy, which is the least favorite part of most students anyway, and especially since it assaults you on your first entrance into the school. It's like this is immediately put in to disillusion you, and it's just another box to check. I mean, I didn't care about macroeconomics, so I didn't put much effort into it. I don't remember anything about it, but I checked it off so I could get my degree. It's kind of like that. Yeah,
it's frustrating in elementary and high school when these are things that are irrelevant to me. These are not, like, these are too basic or these are too hard or whatever it is, for it to then be extended to when you're paying for it. Just really...
Yeah, I mean... But like I say, I understand. I don't think you want kids majoring in computer science who can't give a presentation or who don't know the last 10 presidents or whatever it may be. But I just think that's what high school should be for. I think university, higher education should be, here's where I get to choose what I want to really learn about.
Super specific. And people who are going into university know themselves. They're adults. They're not kids. We're like, oh, I'm just going to skip all these courses. I don't need them. If they actually needed them, like if you actually were interested in macroeconomics, or you were taking another course where it's relevant and you were challenging or struggling with that, maybe you'd then go and take it.
Well,
but,
I think
letting them choose.
I think there should, like, a degree should have required courses, of course. Like, I took an environmental science degree. There should be required environmental science and environmental science adjacent courses. I don't think it should just be willy-nilly. But as you said, they're adults, and if they want to take electives, they'll take electives, and then they'll learn about things they actually want to learn about. Almost everyone's favorite courses were electives, I think.
Of course.
But not forced electives.
My negative grubby holdover that I wanted to talk about, there are many of them. Let's talk about classrooms, perhaps.
Okay.
Because that's one thing I always wondered. I was like, why is every classroom in this entire country identical. Same chairs, same desks, same Pearson textbooks or whatever you have you.
The ceiling tiles with the dots in.
Yep.
I can't tell you how many hours I would just spend counting them and trying to
discern a pattern.
No, not discern a pattern, but trying to like, I would picture a small corner of them and say of the tile and say, okay, that's about 1/10 of this tile. Count how many are in it. Use it to try and estimate how many are in one tile, and then how many for the whole ceiling. And then if I was feeling especially gregarious or adventurous, try and figure out how many for the whole building.
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
I know. But I just always figured the reason classrooms all look the same is because it's the cheapest way to furnish them.
That's pretty much it. I mean, it was originally established in medieval times that a teacher would be lecturing a room full of students all in desks or whatever. And then when education became more widespread, when child labor was banned in North America, a bunch of kids were like flooding to schools, and that's kind of when they stopped being cute, kind of kitschy, what's the word? One room schools. And also schools used to be, they were a little bit more ornate. Maybe there was a nice fountain or a nice yard. But because kids were flocking to sign up for school, they had to put up a bunch really quickly with multiple rooms. And so there came the kind of gross low lighting or whatever. And then again, after World War II, same thing happened. There's a ton of kids who are now like in school. And that's where most of our schools that we went to were built in the 50s and 60s. And one thing in particular that stood out to me that I read about classrooms is why the windows are so dark, or why there's so few windows in a lot of schools.
Yeah.
The reasoning was because in the 70s, when they started trying to conserve energy because of oil shortages and such, they had less windows or boarded up windows or closed them in so there wouldn't be heat escaping to be more efficient.
That makes sense.
A little bit.
I always imagined it was because they wanted to minimize distractions. Like all our lecture halls, they practically had no windows. And one thing that often annoyed me is that they never had any clocks. Yeah. Maybe they thought that sound would annoy people during exams and things, but I just would have liked to know the time.
That'd be nice. Yeah. Yeah, and there was one more thing I read about school designs, and it was that a lot of them in the early 2000s were built to minimize crime in schools. So that's why it's like, it was talking about like the weird angles of stuff. It was like so that people would be able to like see you at all times.
Okay.
It was like this, I don't even know how to describe it, but it was that the schools were just built to minimize crime within them.
Well, I don't know about that, but it does make me think, as did your comment about, or your description of how we're kind of force-fed in short periods of time and not allowed to all have lunch at the same time is very prison-y. You know, it's very like surveillance-y and wearing orange jumpsuits type thing. Phineas and Ferb probably did that a lot. Yeah. Probably showed that in little parody videos. My next grubby holdover, speaking of Phineas and Ferb, the organism of the week is... No, I don't have any. I'm just joking. My next grubby holdover is no school uniforms, or depending on who you're talking to, school uniforms.
Yeah.
And I just kind of wanted to introduce this topic, and I was wondering when they dated from, and it's a little bit hard to date exactly because I think academic institutions and religious institutions tended to blur a lot more. So it's like, well, what's a school and what's a church school? And of course, those are going to have uniforms and such. But at least since the 16th century in the UK, there were school uniforms. And since then, there has been a lot of debate. It's probably been one of the biggest discussions, I would say, in like public educational discourse. Should we have these? Shouldn't we have these? Is it too tyrannical, or would it be just a free-for-all with no guidance? There's been a lot of legal issues, a lot of really public debate, and also conflicting data about the benefits or lack thereof. What do you think about school uniforms?
I like school uniforms.
Me too. I love them.
And I love dressing. Dressing for school in the morning was one of my favorite things. It's fun. Could express yourself with your clothes, but also it's distracting. And I just think school uniforms build a sense of community, and they have a lot of positives in my mind.
Well, the reason I mention it is because I think for next week it should be designer Solacene school uniform.
Ooh.
I thought that'd be fun.
Yes.
Have you seen that TikTok meme? It's like, oh, you're dressing for school, but then you forgot that you go to the Euphoria High School.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the Squidward sound.
Mm-hmm.
I think that just sums it all up. I don't think that, I mean, again, I sound like such a boomer, but I don't think that high school hallways should be like a runway.
I agree.
And I'm all for creativity in students and freedom and things like that. But I think there should be a deeper level of creativity and freedom instilled in them, not just this kind of like superficial rebellion of I'm going to wear what I want to school, and then that shows them who I am, because it doesn't really.
No, it's school uniforms take equity in a good way, whereas I feel like the way that schools try and make things equal is this kind of polar opposite of, oh, someone's like, I'm just like making room for the differences instead of encouraging students to be a community and be one, and making room for the differences sounds bad, but I don't mean it in that way. I just mean in like they're not encouraging people to come together in the middle. They're just trying to like broaden what they accept in this bad way to me.
Well, I remember in school in England, I used to really, really, really despise the school uniforms. Our school uniform was, it was a white polo shirt, I think, for the boys, and either a bright red or a bright green jumper with like gray trousers or shorts and black like crispy shoes. And I always used to really despise, my least favorite day of each year was in August or something before school started, when we go shoe shopping. And I was like, I don't like these types of shoes. I want to wear trainers or sneakers. And I'd always be kind of envious of the people who
got to bend the rules a little bit.
Yeah, who were kind of bending the rules a little bit. But now I know that, or now I think that if I had been in a school that was just a free-for-all and I was 8 or 7, I would have been a lot more envious of the people who were wearing shoes that I didn't have and things like that. And I just love the idea that it would minimize the way that kids put themselves into hierarchies based on what they're wearing.
That was like probably always the biggest thing that I was ever like bullied for, was what I wore.
Yeah.
And that was honestly just because it was like I was always wearing kind of just whatever. I dressed pretty practically from a young age and fun, and I always would like tuck my shirts in and stuff, and people would always make fun of me. But yeah, if I was tucking in my uniform shirt, I feel like it'd be a lot different than tucking in my like shirt with a monkey on it or whatever. Yeah. I love school uniforms. I'm excited to design one for next week. Something that I don't love, something else I don't love, one of the many, many things, is standardization, which I didn't realize how much I disliked until preparing for this season.
I think, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but one of the reasons I didn't hate standardization when I was in it is because it's so easy to game. And I was just all about getting good grades, so multiple choice and really predictable tests and very basic and kind of by the numbers curriculums. Doesn't require a lot of engagement, really. Yeah,
that's exactly it. Because the reason that standardization is so easy to game is because in the States, because I don't know too much about Canada, I was mainly looking at the States. It was, okay, we want all of the test scores to be standardized so we know how different school boards are doing, schools. And if your school can't reach these certain standards, either your whole staff will be fired or the school will be closed. So they had to start standardizing curriculum so that they would be able to more universally achieve these test scores. So it wasn't like, oh, we're standardizing the curriculum so that everyone has a really well-rounded education. It was literally just to cater to these few tests, which were established hundreds of years before and very minimally modified. So they were testing really outdated knowledge back from the Industrial Revolution.
It's slow, right? It's clumsy. It's slow and clumsy to change because it's so big. One thing that we always say about Canada, and it fits for the US as well, is that by most of the world's standards, they're not really countries. They're much more like continents. So why would someone on the East Coast be learning the same as someone on the West Coast? It doesn't make a lot of sense.
It's so silly to me. Yeah, and even I learned that the Common Core curriculum was pretty much written by just 27 people in a room, like over less than a year. And if you're developing a school curriculum for a country as huge as the States, it should be thousands of people coming together to write it. And okay, they're going to write in caveats for different places. This is where you can insert your local history, you can insert your local experiences or what have you. And yeah, not a fan of standardization. I have a question perhaps of like, what are some alternatives to standardization? Because I suppose it would just be basically, well, not standard changes, but like some examples perhaps.
Yeah. I understand the need for school boards and some level of standardization because I think it's good that the government keeps an eye on that kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. You don't want schools just indoctrinating kids with like something that the whole area doesn't like, or whatever.
Or like you don't want a giant difference between the rich and the poor areas. Mm-hmm. That's not fair. So I do think standardization makes sense from that perspective, but finding a balance, yeah, that's a good question for next week.
Yeah, and like, yeah, raising the floor. It was talking about the lunches in France. I was watching this video about it, and it said the floor is so high. Like the floor in like the most impoverished neighborhood, the school that has like no funding, their lunches are still better than anything you're going to get in America for the most part. And obviously there's still disparities, but the disparities are just so much less because of the high floor.
Yeah, the dropout rate and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one example of a kind of relic of standardization that I was questioning was the fact that we are grouped at all just by the year that we are born in. And the alternative to this is like kind of merit based. So if you're really smart, you move up with the kids who are doing this, and you know, it's a little bit more like that. And I was looking at the origin of why we do that, kind of group them by their year of birth. And I think it was just because it's the easiest thing to do, as you said, once there was a rush towards schools. The expansion from the small 1 or 2 room schoolhouse, it's kind of like, well, how else are you going to divide them? And those are the kinds of holdovers that I always think are ripe for big revolution, the things that no one's really considered, you know, to any great length. And that when it was being instated, not a lot of thought went into it.
Yeah. And I feel like the thing with like grouping children based on something other than age, it's always like, okay, you're starting as a 5-year-old and you're being labeled as
16.
Less capable or whatever on a scale, like it's going to stay with you, and that group of kids is going to be less prosperous perhaps. But if you did it in a way that was like the language was well researched and the kids weren't like told, hey, you're being held back, or like, hey, you get to skip a grade, because obviously those kids who skip a grade are always going to be above the rest because they have that boost of confidence and so on.
That's why I mean it's a rocky subject, but
yeah,
it just strikes me again because, like I said, even the kids within a grade they have about a year between them anyway. So
yeah, for sure. Speaking of grubby holdovers, the organism of the week is. Do you know what that is? For my drawing?
Some sort of jellyfish.
Nope. It's a crab, a horseshoe crab.
Well, I don't think it was drawn very well then.
It's one of the oldest organisms on Earth.
Wow.
300 million years old. Can you believe it?
Take that, humans.
Yeah. They look like prehistoric crabs, but they're not crabs. They're in the family of creepy crawlies. They're like sea scorpions and other things that are creepy and crawly. They have 10 legs. They have
10 legs? I'm not seeing that. I see one stick.
This is their armor. They have this armor on top of them. Which, I need to describe it. They have a little armor.
Yes.
And then they have these kind of spiky things coming out of the armor and a really long tail. And then underneath the armor is a bunch of eyes.
No.
Yeah. But they're underneath. You don't have to see them. Legs and all of their organs and everything. Their brains. They're found in almost all of the oceans in the world. And they change areas based on season and like season of their life. And during full moons, new moons, and high tides during May and June, hundreds of thousands of them crawl onto the beach in Delaware Bay.
That sounds terrifying.
I would not want to be there.
How big are they? Did you see a picture of them?
Yeah, they're like 12 to 18 inches. Diameter.
Does it look like something that would creep me out?
Yeah.
My family loves the story of when we were on a beach and I was young, and I think I don't know if I touched a crab or just saw one, but they said they've never seen me sprint so fast and so far, just across this crowded beach, and I'm pretty sure I was screaming all the way. So crabs, I'm kind of creeped out by crabs.
Yeah, so that's why I did a pretty simple drawing.
I appreciate that, yeah.
Yeah, but super old, and I also thought it was cool that they change areas based on age of their life, because I feel like when we're talking about kids and when they should start school and such, it's a question of them moving around, not being in the same classroom for 13 years.
Yeah, that's a reach.
It's a reach, but I went there.
And they also kind of move around in schools of fish.
Oh.
My last grubby holdover is the lecture. Not the entire, I'm not kind of writing off the whole form of it, but I'll say the lecture as the dominant or even sole form of transmission of information.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, again, it's hard to date when people listen to one person talking, but even from a formal, organized standpoint, it dates back to at least the 5th century BC in ancient Greece, as we mentioned in our zine, the education zine available now. Yeah, that idea of someone giving an unbroken diatribe to explain a concept to other people, perhaps younger, who don't know the concept, makes a lot of sense, especially in a world where there are no books or internet. In a world where we do have books or internet, doing that solely as the most efficient way of teaching kids everything for 12 years seems a little bit outdated to me. Qu'en pensez-vous?
I agree. That's not how we learn for the most part. The best way in my head would be some kind of hybrid where people get to explore the concepts on their own, be it peruse books, they just set out a bunch of things and you try and make the connections on your own, and then the lecture afterwards to reinforce and say, okay, you thought this, you're right, or you thought this, you're wrong.
Yeah.
And so on. So I think lectures as supplementary. Lectures are like one of the best ways that I learn.
No, I love lectures.
Yeah. But it's like, it can't be just lectures.
Yeah, that's the thing.
There's so many lectures I've forgotten.
Exactly. There's a few that I remember, though. And those are some of the highlights of my life. So some of the really great lectures. But yeah, having them be the sole thing. I had this idea, this is just maybe a radical idea, but a school that is just tests. So every class, you're being tested. And I like this idea from this anime movie called Ocean Waves. There's a giant scoreboard on the wall that all the kids are like on like a league table kind of graded.
Yeah.
So it's all about assessments. And
Okay.
everything all the learning is done independently, except for maybe there are some classes where it's like troubleshooting classes. Troubleshooting Tuesday.
Okay. I hear you.
It's an interesting idea though, right?
It's an idea.
Well, okay, you might not like it because you don't like the kids being pitted against each other or whatever. But,
I don't, but
it would work. I think it would work.
Yeah.
Hogwarts, again, with like the points. Also, I think that since I already mentioned, I think Timothy Goes to School and Hogwarts and Ocean Waves, and I was going to mention Dead Poets Society. For next week, we should have a question, which is our favorite examples of education in media.
Ooh, I like that a lot.
Yeah.
As you know, I'll probably just pick Hogwarts, but you never know. I might be able to find something new.
That's all my grubbies.
All your grubby grapes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Some of my final things for this episode were about how we rely so much on phones. Our question from last week was, how do we internalize knowledge in a world of externalization? Phrase something like that.
Yep.
And it was hard to think of this because it's been so long that we relied on, even like since the dawn of writing, we've relied on externalizing knowledge. But I think there's a difference between externalizing knowledge on paper and externalizing it on a phone and relying on Google. Because I read this good quote and it said, it's not that your brain's like stupid or something. It's just that it moves slightly slower than Google. So you're always going to go to Google because it'll be faster than you having to wait a couple days for that movie to pop into your head.
Yeah.
And the way that our brains organize knowledge is like shock-based, basically. So like the most shocking things you ever experienced, you'd recall immediately. If someone said, oh, should you like feed a dog and like have your face up in their face? You'd be like, no, because you were bitten by a dog as a kid.
It's true.
But
being on Google is the most mundane, no danger, nothing memorable about it activity, which is why we also tend to remember things that other people tell us a lot more, right?
Exactly.
Because fundamentally it's terrifying to talk to people, not just if you have social anxiety, but even if you don't, it's knowing what humans do, and it's a scary idea.
Yeah, and you always remember the questions you got wrong in class way more than the ones you got right, because you're embarrassed.
Yeah, I like what you said about like Google's going to know that movie way before you do, because something I wanted to mention in last week's episode but forgot to, in support of the idea that there's a real joy to learning, is how often you will have a movie in your head and you're like, oh, I want to know this movie, and someone will say, I'll Google it, and you go, no, don't look it up. I need to figure this out by yourself, because there's a pride to it, right? Like you want to prove to yourself that you can remember something, and our memories don't really get exercised that often anymore. So I would say that last week we were kind of making the case for why we should be trying to reintegrate or re-internalize all this knowledge. this week we're going into more practical methods of how we can do so.
Mm-hmm.
So I started out with just mindfulness, which I think we maybe overuse that word on this podcast a lot. But in this case, I'm talking about a deliberate awareness of what we're learning, how we're learning it, and why we're learning it, and what we actually want to be learning. Because I think so often with the internet, hopefully this isn't an experience unique to me, I go down rabbit holes of things, and then it seems so important in the moment. And then afterwards, I'm like, why was I looking at like celebrity heights or, you know, different types of shoes? And you don't remember most of it because you weren't actually that.
You weren't intentional in learning it.
You weren't actually that invested. It's just that the internet can make things seem like a choose your own adventure. It's like, okay, I read this page. It's directing me to this page. I have to do that.
Yeah. As you were saying with the, let me remember it. Let me do it. Like, don't look it up. It's like we need to start learning to trust our reflexes instead of just trusting Google or trusting our instincts, because you're never going to say something without fact checking it for the most part. And as you were just saying about the rabbit holes and intentional learning and mindfulness, it's also just like when you practice mindfulness, you can kind of start to memorize things for the sake of it, because you never need to memorize it. You don't need to learn math. You don't need to do any of these things because you will, in fact, always have your phone on you. But practicing mindfulness for the sake of it and memorization for the sake of it, it'll strengthen those pathways just like literally. So then you'll start memorizing things a little easier and so on.
Yeah, I mean, we've been using Google as the example, but I'm going to posit BuzzFeed. So let's say, not the quizzes, but let's say you read an article about, this person's just been cast in a movie that you actually do care about, and you search it up and you read the BuzzFeed article and it's like, okay, I got my information. Oh, he's playing him. That's cool. You scroll to the bottom and then there's 3 recommended articles. This other movie is also starring this other person, and you click that and it keeps going, like the recommendations at the end, right? So I'm going to say maybe a concrete tool to try and promote mindfulness in this way is to never click links, because links, generally, you didn't search for them.
That's a really interesting point. I like that.
Why be at the behest of an algorithm like that? Kind of.
That's really powerful. Like, I don't know
Thank you.
how else to put it, but it's how we feel. You go on TikTok or Instagram to do one thing, and then you get sucked in because of an algorithm, and that's just controlling you and then decreasing your concentration and literally your brain's capacity. It's frustrating.
I think the mindfulness, it's like it was never needed in history because it was never so easy to accidentally learn things that we didn't want to. But today I know so many song lyrics, and I know of movies that I've never watched, and I know politics of countries that I don't belong to, you know, and I never really tried to learn any of those things. It just kind of happened to me. So I think we need to be mindful and set up barriers and say, no, I'm only going to let in certain things sometimes.
Yeah, it's also proven that we remember things that people say to us way more than anything we read or just kind of come to at our own, because our brains value relationships. So another kind of practical tool is socializing. And I also am going to say write, don't type, and say things out loud. Because, you know, when you have to memorize a phone number or you have to memorize a certain address really quickly, you have nowhere to write it down. You just say it and say it and say it because it solidifies it in your brain. And same with writing. Like writing stuff on paper, you're forging something that didn't exist, whereas typing is fleeting.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree on the writing versus typing thing. I also think that having a distinct place for the internet, we've extolled the virtues before of the computer room. So not always having your phone on you, I think that can be a good thing, because that way you're walking around without a safety net. And when I was trying to prepare for this episode, I was thinking a lot about the analogy of learning your way around a city or learning your way around a place that you don't know very well, with new streets, and maybe you don't recognize street names, maybe you don't even speak the language of the city, and you don't yet have that kind of visual memory of, oh, well, I know this building or this corner, you know, and I know where this place is in relation to that. And I was thinking that when you have your phone on you, I won't say you never learn the city, but it takes you a lot longer time than if you just didn't have the safety net, right? Because you don't have to. You don't have to know your way around at all.
Yeah, I read this quote of stop feeding your comfort zone, which is what you do when you're constantly referring to a map on your phone, or you're constantly referring to the same recipe, like you said last week, you're feeding a comfort zone, a space that you're comfortable in, so your brain's never going to expand and build new pathways.
Yeah, I actually found a whole article about this, which was called The Dangers of Externalizing Knowledge. And I have a quote written by someone called Devin Coldway. It was a blog post. And he said, while consulting the GPS means you don't build an internal map of your neighborhood, consulting the external knowledge of the internet means you don't build a map of your entire intellectual world. So it's like,
oh, wow.
That idea of being geographically clueless, which, I mean, some people are just geographically clueless. Like I happily admit that about myself, like with directions and knowing where I am physically, I'm probably in like the bottom 5% for the whole world. Very, very bad at it. But it doesn't mean it's not something that can be trained and improve that. And as you said about comfort zones, it's not good to just say, well, directions, I'm hopeless. Good thing I have Google.
Yeah, that's exciting to know that we can change our brains. We always act like they're fixed from the age we're 8, but no, we can change them. We can retrain ourselves to be readers and to be writers and to be creative.
Another thing I like about the computer room is that, I mean, let's say in the Solacene, in the magical future utopia, everyone also has a computer room, so they don't have their phone on them. I think it would be easier to talk to people in real life because, let's say, in the elevator, they can't just be like, oh, what's happening with Jack Black? You know, if someone else walks in, so they don't have to awkwardly interact with them.
Yeah.
And another thing is that I think it would actually incentivize a more positive use of the Google, of the internet, because you would pretty much only Google things. Or let's say your living room is like your home base, and that's where you have your computer, and that's where you kind of are, for the most part, learning. And then you're going out and doing your work and doing your exercise and doing your hanging out with other people and doing your travel and things like that. And along the way, you're having observations and you're, oh, that looks cool. I want to know a little bit more about that. And this looks cool. So you actually have to remember them, or at least write them down before you go back to your base and kind of research them, instead of just saying, wow, that's a cool shirt. I'm going to look it up right now.
Yeah, it's going to strengthen your memory, and maybe you could tell me like, oh, that was actually stupid.
Exactly. That's
and
exactly
you don't
it.
look it up. Yeah, I feel like there'd be a lot of those. We both looked up the Weeble Wobble song before bed last night. So
right.
There was that.
Was that necessary?
No, it kept us up for an extra 10 minutes.
Could we have let the debate just simmer?
We could have. This is like an intervention, but yes. I think the only other thing I had for this was that we need to organize our spaces better and our artifacts better, because it's like, okay, someone writes down their phone number, instead of just immediately putting in your phone, maybe you write it in a journal where you keep people's phone numbers. And the act of writing it down, or the act of putting a date on the calendar, you're going to remember it way better than if you just put it in
places
space.
For each thing.
Yes.
Instead of just the digital pit for everything.
Yeah, because then you have the physical map of your space in your head, which you can refer to, instead of just the dimensionless iPhone.
Yeah, I had a final thing, which was a way of improving your memory and internalizing your knowledge was to actually practice doing so, practice memorizing things. And it sounds kind of silly, but I realized I have never really practiced memorizing at all. So I think I'm going to start doing that. And the examples that came to mind were like when kids have to practice scripture, and that can be debated, but I like the thought behind it, which is that they won't always need a Bible on them. They'll just always... they have internalized those things. I think that's a nice idea. Another key element of memorization and improving at it is good sleep. Most people don't do that. Meditation also really helps a lot because you're clearing your mind. And learning an instrument or learning a language, I found, was a good hobby. Yeah, and even doing crossword puzzles and games like that helps promote memory and internalizing knowledge, because you're drawing on those things. Like playing Scrabble, you can't take out your phone. You need to recall the words. Chess also helps a lot. Jigsaw puzzles I thought were fun. And because that's like, oh, I remember that piece. That was somewhere over there. Jigsaw puzzles, those are really good for like helping people age well mentally, right? I think. Yeah, they are. I always like the idea of jigsaw puzzles. This is completely off topic, but I never know what to do. What do you do with it once you finish? That's always what... I don't know. Do you just, oh, that was fun, and then you put it all back in the box, and then we'll redo that next Saturday? I'm always kind of confused about the life. Because you could do the same jigsaw puzzle again and again, and it's not going to get that much easier, because it's about finding the pieces. I don't know.
Maybe that's a question for next week. What do you do with jigsaw puzzles when you're done with them?
Dancing also apparently is another practice that
I didn't know that.
because you have to learn steps.
Yeah.
I have never learned to dance, but perhaps if you kind of break it down so it's more like math, because that's who I am, maybe I'd enjoy it more.
Perhaps. Yes, I did ballet for most of my life, so maybe it helped improve my memory. I don't know if it did.
I also came up with an activity which was just to practice recalling things. So like, let's say you make a list, like a grocery list, and you have like 10 or 11 things on it, and you say, okay, I wrote this in an hour, I'm going to try and remember it. It reminds me of the Nintendo game designer Shigeru Miyamoto, who always says that one of his lifelong fun activities is he'll see something in real life, guess the length of it, pull out a ruler, and see how close he was. In terms of saying that's like a fun activity, that's about the level of it, I think.
Yeah.
It's very wholesome, and I don't know, I like that.
Yeah. It's like a secret power.
Exactly.
And I feel like memorization today is a secret power. Imagine if someone asked you the name, who is that actor in that movie? And you just always have it. Like, that's your niche of things that you remember. I like that. And I feel like people used to always know poems.
Well, what about this? Let's say you meet someone, here, do you want to put your number in my phone? No, just tell me.
My cousin used to do that. And he's a year older than me.
Yeah.
I remember one time he's like, I forgot my phone at home. Can I use yours? And I was like, sure. And I was like, do you know their number? And he's like, yeah. And he knew everyone's number. I'm like, do you know my number? This guy I talk to like a couple times a year. He's like, yeah.
I
was like, what?
In middle school, there were probably me, and I think at its peak, it got to about 11 or 12 of us, other kids in the grade, who would memorize each other's locker combinations, like always peek and learn them all. And none of them were written down. And we used to just switch them to annoy people. So every time you go to your locker, you'd be like, because someone had switched it. So you had to run through like 11 combinations. Yeah. Each of them being 3 numbers. And now I'm really impressed I could do that.
It's funny.
Yeah.
I didn't know that about you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was a real trickster. You
still are.
That's true.
You scared me this morning by knocking on the bedroom window like a psycho. Thank you all for listening.
Yep.
If you want to have more of our antics, we are on Instagram. Aaron has a blog. We have a website. It's all linked below. And we look forward to seeing you next week.